Hello everyone and welcome to our very first webinar of our very new series called Climate Action Charter. So today we'll be focusing on the topic of beyond value chain mitigation. I'm Lionel and together with my colleague Stephanie will be your host today. So that's the agenda. We'll start by setting the scene. We'll be explaining why corporate climate action and beyond value chain mitigation in particular are so urgently needed. Then I'll explain what beyond value chain mitigation is and how it relates to carbon credits. And Stephanie will tell you a few words about carbon credits, how they work, and the key principle to take into account when you're planning to purchase carbon credits. And finally, we'll showcase two concrete examples from the field, one forest protection project in Peru and one biogas project in Kenya. And then in the end, we'll have around 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. So these are the housekeeping rules. So basically, if you have questions, just use the box on the right to submit the questions. We'll try to answer all of them at the end of the presentation. But if we don't manage, then we'll answer them in writing. If you go to the next slide, as I said, that's the first webinar of a series of 6. As you see here, we have two kind of subcategories of webinar. The first one is Climate Action 101, and today's webinar is part of that, in which we will try to explain to you a bit the basics of climate action. And then we also have another category which is called Climate Action Deep Dives, in which we will explore some subjects a bit more in details. For example, we'll talk about removals in July, we'll talk about local projects in September, and finally, at the end of the year, we will look at the trends for 2024. So if you haven't yet registered to these other webinars, I invite you to just scan the QR code on the left and to get started. Now, if you go to the next slide, so I'm Lionel Tevna. I'm Sustainability Advisor at South Pole, focusing mainly on agricultural value chain. I'm based in Zurich, and I have a background in economics and food security.
Hi, also from my side, my name is Stephanie. I'm a Sustainability Advisor at South Pole since last year, and I have also the pleasure of being the country lead for Austria, working together with Austrian companies on helping them on their climate journey and their sustainability goals.
Okay, so we'll get started with a very short introduction about South Pole. If you don't already know us, we've grown from a small group of university friends and students based in Switzerland in 2006. So they founded South Pole back then. And right now we're around 1,300 people in more than 50 locations all around the world. And in the meantime, we've helped develop over 1,000 climate projects, which makes us one of the biggest climate project developer worldwide. And we have thousands of companies to reduce their climate impact. And we're only just getting started. Now on the next slide, I just want to explain to you a bit why beyond value chain mitigation and corporate climate action is necessary. So let's start with a vision for the global economy. You might know that under the Paris Agreement, 196 parties or countries adopted a motion saying that they will do their best to hold the increase in global average temperature to well below 0 above pre-industrial levels, and that they will push their efforts to limit it to even 1.5 degrees. That agreement was signed in 2015. And now let's fast forward to 2023. So today, the average global temperature increase already reached around 1.2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. And this chart maps out a bit the different scenarios for the future. So you see the yellow part is what's going to happen, or what's very likely to happen if no climate policies were implemented. So as you see, doesn't look that good. Then we have the green part, which is if countries continue with their current policies. In purple, you have if countries follow on with the pledges, and then you have a huge gap, the white part, and below you see what we have to achieve in terms of emission reductions if we want to stay within 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. So basically, if our aim is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, then we are clearly far off track. And concretely, what we have to do to avert climate disaster is, quite simply put, to halve our emissions by 2030 and to reach net zero emissions by 2050. So there's still a lot to do. As you can see on the graph, the gap is still big, but there is hope. Because if we take into account that the private sector is responsible for approximately 75% of global greenhouse emissions, then there's a lot that businesses can do. It also holds a lot of opportunities for those taking action. Now on the next slide. So the need and urgency for climate action all makes sense on paper, but no one said it was going to be easy. And on the next slide, you see that the science-based targets try to make it a bit more actionable and develop an action plan in 4 steps. The first one is to measure your scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse emissions, then to set targets and to reduce your emission along a science-based approach aligned with 1.5 degree. The third point, and we'll get back to that also later, is that while reducing, you have to finance avoidance and removal activities outside of your value chain, that's so-called beyond value chain mitigation. And the fourth point is, after the reductions are achieved, you have to neutralize the residual emissions by financing removal activities. Now, on the next slide, we try to show that at a company level. So here, you see the orange part is the business as usual scenario. That's what's going to happen if we don't do anything, and that's exactly what we don't want to happen. So what we need to happen is, as I said, halve our emissions by 2030, and then continue reducing until we've done everything we can do to reduce emissions. And this is shown here in the gray, with the gray area. And then alongside these efforts, if you click once more, we see that beyond value chain mitigation is here to mainly preserve the carbon sinks that we have and finance global energy transition in countries that cannot yet afford this transition. And then the last part is to remove the equivalent of remaining emissions. That's the blue part. That's called neutralization. So according to science-based targets, you have to reduce your emissions, and then by the time you aim to reach net zero, then you have to compensate and to neutralize those remaining emissions by investing in removal projects. So just one last point before we move to the next slide. The certified contributions have a key role to play in holistic net zero strategy in 2 ways. The first one is that beyond value chain mitigation, and it's not just a nice to have. The SBTI strongly recommends that company take action and invest in beyond their value chain in order to reduce to achieve global net zero through beyond value chain mitigation. And then, as I said, the blue part, which is the removals. Now, if we go to the next slide, try to define a bit what is exactly beyond value chain mitigation. So basically, it encompasses all investment and actions that a company takes beyond its science-based target, so beyond its reduction, to mitigate emission outside of the value chain. So basically, it's everything that's outside the scope 1, 2, and 3 of the company, and can be either removal or avoidance. A few examples include, for example, investing in conservation projects or investing in energy efficiency measures outside of your value chain. But just to be clear, it doesn't have to be carbon credits, or the type of investments in climate projects will likely also be considered as beyond value chain mitigation, but carbon credits offer quite a few benefits. For example, they are readily available, they cover a broad range of project types, they have an impact that is quantified and certified by widely recognized standards such as Gold Standard or Verra. and they also have a very low barrier to entry. So you don't need to have 1 million euro to start investing in carbon credits. You can already start with a quite small budget. So I think that makes carbon credits a very good candidate for companies wanting to invest in beyond value chain mitigation. And that's also why we're going to talk later about those carbon credits. And that's my last slide on beyond value chain mitigation. It's actually a very interesting time if you're interested in the topic, because as you see on the right, the Science Based Targets initiative just launched last week public consultation with the aim of gathering feedbacks from different stakeholders in order to finalize the final guidance that they will publish in Q4 2023. So if you're interested in the topic, and if you want to also have your say on what the final guidance will look like, then I will encourage you to go through the document and participate in the survey. And with that, I'll hand over to my colleague Stephanie.
Thank you very much, Lionel, for kicking us off. As mentioned, I'm going to dive into the carbon credits part a bit, and it has been mentioned a lot now, and maybe you're sitting here now and wondering, okay, this makes sense. We understand the need for climate action, for financing climate action, but where do carbon credits come into this? So what is a carbon credit, or what are carbon credits? One carbon credit is the equivalent to 1 ton of CO2 equivalent that is reduced or removed from the atmosphere through an emission reduction project. But we can also look at it from another perspective, which is a financing mechanism. So in very simple terms, carbon credits are a financing mechanism that help us become active. We can split it into 2 different angles. First of all, looking at it from a global level, financing climate action projects is a very cost-effective and an immediate and scalable route to drive down the global emissions and finance the transition that we need to go to net zero. It is funding nature projects, new technologies, and there's a broad variety of projects, as Lionel mentioned. They channel a very vital investment into forestry projects, into local communities, renewable energies, especially in the global south, where there are very few other revenue streams available. And if you look at it from a company level, so from your perspective, I suppose, they are helpful to put a price on a carbon footprint. It creates a costs, showing those externalities on your balance sheets, and those costs are something that a CEO and a CFO can much better understand and grip, because they want to get their hands off it. They want to reduce it, get it off their balance sheet. So suddenly it has a price tag, and this helps to incentivize the value chain reductions. On the next slide, thank you very much. We take a look at the foundations of a carbon credit, because not everything is a carbon credit project in that sense. If it meets a certain standard, like Vera or a gold standard, for example, the most common ones, it has to meet certain standards and contributions to be eligible to be named as such. I don't want to go into detail and go into every one of those, but I want to mention 2. For example, additionality, which means that the sequestration or the avoided emission must be additional to what would have otherwise occurred without any intervention. So it must be incremental. That is one key thing, for example. The other one is uniqueness, which basically means that there is only one carbon credit that can be associated with this single reduction or removal of this ton CO2 equivalent. So there's no double counting between projects or governmental greenhouse gas accounts, which is a topic that we very often discuss. That was a bit too fast. Not yet, maybe jump back one slide, because I want to highlight a very important part. There is no other form of finance that can claim this level of transparency and traceability in measuring impacts that are channeled through the carbon markets. Yet, especially in the last couple of months, we've seen a lot of criticism that has come, and very rightly in some cases. We want to highlight that we've always been very much welcoming the discussion around the topic, because it is very much needed. It is needed that, and that's the original, in the original sense of the way, the voluntary carbon market and projects and methodologies are meant to develop and become better. There will always be new developments and technologies that will supersede what was previously considered best practice, and that's exactly the feature that it has. The big challenge is that the complexity of the voluntary carbon market, the VCM as it is called, is very difficult to understand and very easy to criticize because it has very little transparency, unfortunately. But as we already pointed out, the climate action, especially from the private sector, is absolutely needed, and we have to modify and make the system better as we go. Cool. So let's jump to the next slide. Thank you very much. Because I want to highlight the climate action and especially also the inaction in numbers. And especially I want to dive into or mention two numbers here. So the first one being the 5,000 billion annual climate finance that is required by 2030 already to achieve the 1.5 target that Lionel mentioned in the beginning. And right now, so today, the total size of the voluntary carbon market is in US dollars 2 billion. So I think that already shows pretty well where the gap lies, and that leads us to the very urgent call to action. If you jump to the next slide, the very urgent call to action that is accelerate your climate action, because the calls from the IPCC or the SBTI that Lionel mentioned in the beginning, among others, they have made it very clear that companies must invest in climate action outside their value chains on top of reducing their emissions. Reducing the emissions, and I think that's also something that we always make very clear, reducing and decarbonizing is at the top and the absolute forefront of things. But on the side of that, it is important to invest in beyond value chain mitigation. And one of the biggest questions that has been around for a while is whether buying carbon credits actually slows down action. In the last couple of months, there was a lot of media scrutiny around companies that have been investing in carbon credits and still are doing so. And newspapers have been criticizing those big companies that they are paying off their debt. And new research has shown that actually quite opposite is the case. And I think it's very important to mention that, because in fact, those buying carbon credits are reducing their emissions 2 times faster than those who are not purchasing carbon credits. And I think it's a very extremely important fact that I want to highlight here, because that also brings me one level down, if you jump to the next slide, to distinguish between projects and what kind of projects do exist and what they are doing. So how do you set yourself up today to maximize the impact and align your compensation with the net zero objective? You can do it basically with 2 different types of projects, which are carbon avoidance and carbon removal. And I will go into detail in a second. As a starting off, we recommend starting with supporting avoidance projects and integrating carbon removal projects over time more and more into your portfolio to maximize the climate benefit and to align to your net zero objective. So what are avoidance projects? For example, forest protection, renewable energy, or cook stove projects. Those projects prevent emissions from being released into the atmosphere. So that means some of the benefits are, for example, the extremely vital transition that is needed to finance for polluting industries, protecting the natural carbon sinks, like as mentioned, forests or also mangroves. They also cut methane emissions, which is a very potent greenhouse gas, as you might know. On the other side, removals is a different kind of thing. It actually, both nature-based and technology-based, lowers the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere. And this will become increasingly important as we are moving closer to the global net zero target by 2050, as the need for carbon removal increases, as Lionel mentioned in the beginning, in order to achieve net zero and neutralizing the residual emissions that you have as a company. And let's make it doubly clear, as we move to net zero, both natural and technological removals will be an absolute key. So we need companies to start investing in those today. And I think that was enough with the theoretical concepts and frameworks. Now that we have shared a lot of that, I want to talk a little bit about practice and make it a bit more tangible. So we're going to look into 2 projects as promised in the beginning. And for the first one, I want to take you to the South American Andes, more specifically to the Amazonian Andes in central North Peru. This area combines 2 regions that are very significant. There are tropical Andes on the one side and the Great Wild Area of the Amazon. The project that I'm talking about is the Alto Huayllabamba Conservation. It is a carbon avoidance project that spans over 50,000 hectares. And this project does in the main setup 2 things. It prevents, firstly, deforestation. So the main drivers of deforestation in the area was clearing land for pasture, industrial crops, mining, for example. And these activities have become more prevalent due to the lack of alternative economic opportunities. So that means this was putting an increasing pressure on the land and the local wildlife. On the second hand, it also prevents land degradation. So it shows effective land management, transferring skills of environmental education to the local communities, and it strengthens the local governance. So that aside, and I think this is also already very strong, it also helps to maintain the water balance of the Huayllabamba River, which supplies the waters for the local families. And on average, this project avoids 52,000 tons of CO2 equivalent from being released into the atmosphere every year. By preventing the deforestation, by conserving this natural ecosystem, and boost carbon sequestration. This is a REDD+ project. So REDD is a very common terminology, which means reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And these kind of projects have been especially criticized recently. And one thing that I want to really highlight here is, as much as planting trees is important, and I think we've seen it very recently with the wildfires in Canada that have been all over the news, it is of key importance that we preserve the existing forests that we have. Because if we don't do that, there is no point. And I also want to highlight that this project also helps protecting many endemic and threatened animal species, and it strengthens the local community. And if you jump to the next slide, if you want to learn more about the Alto Huayllabamba project, please visit our YouTube channel, the South Pole YouTube channel. You can also scan the QR code that you see on this slide. I can only invite you to check it out because pictures speak for themselves, and this probably will do more to you than listen to me explaining it. So I can only emphasize that. And with that, I say thank you, and I want to hand it back to Lionel, who will take us to Kenya.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, so I'll introduce you to that project, which is about biogas for Kenyan farmers. So just a bit to set the scene, for those of you that had the chance to travel to the global south, you might have noticed that a lot of people still rely on open fire for cooking. So basically, the family goes, collect some wood, and then they cook directly using that wood, usually in an unvented kitchen. According to the WHO, there are today still around 3 billion people that are relying either on solid fuels such as charcoal or wood, or kerosene for everyday cooking. And the kind of issue with this cooking is that, well, of course, it's inefficient, but it has negative effect first of all on the health, because you can imagine when the whole family is inside the house and someone is cooking using wood, then it leads to a lot of exposure to the smoke. Then you also have negative impact on the environment, because in order to get that fuel, you usually have to cut down trees and then bring them back to your house and then burn them. And the third aspect is also this kind of cooking methods also have an impact on the societal level, because it's usually the wives and the kids that have to take time to go to the market or to the forest to gather the fuel, and that leads to the fact that they cannot invest that time or the money that they spend on the market into more productive activities. So as you see, you have kind of a negative impact on the three levels. And so if you were to find a way to replace these kind of traditional inefficient cooking techniques by cleaner and more affordable ones, they will have tremendous positive impact on social aspects, on the health, and of course on the environment. And no surprise here, that's exactly what the project does. And in rural Kenya, you have a double problem. So on the one hand, people are still relying on wood to cook, and on the other hand, managing animal manure also poses environmental and health-related problems, as Kenyan farmers lack the systems to manage the manure from their animals, and it's often just left untreated. And of course, it releases methane and can have a bad influence on the health of the people around. So what is the solution, or what is one of the most viable solutions that we have found? Well, of course, carbon finance. And so in one sentence, what this project does is financing the installation of small-scale biogas digesters at the farms. Maybe if you go back one slide, there's a nice picture just to show a bit what it looks like. And then, so basically the farmers collect the manure, they put it into the bags, and then it's digested and it generates biogas, which is then used on the farm or in the households. Yeah, exactly, and thus minimizing the negative impact of the untreated manure on the one hand, and of using the wood to cook. And that is, for me, a very great example of how carbon finance can have positive impact, of course, on the carbon emissions. I guess that's the reason number one why companies would invest in such a project, but it also has very nice social and economic aspects and co-benefits. So I think that's quite a bit too often overlooked when with climate projects. They are not only about reducing 1 ton of carbon, but also about creating new opportunities, improving health, and participating in the energy transition. And of course, that's the kind of projects that can be funded by companies that are investing in beyond value chain mitigation. Now, to wrap up, if we go to the next slide, we wanted to remind you a bit of the basic principles for beyond value chain mitigation. So the first one is invest in climate action projects that are in line with the principles of your company, with your values, with your activities. Then second point is to invest in projects that support the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So look at the co-benefits and look for projects that not only target carbon, but have also a positive impact on the society and on the health of the people around. Then the third one is don't stop reducing your emissions when you invest in beyond value chain mitigation. It's not either reducing or investing. It really has to be both at the same time. And then communicate your use of carbon credits accurately and transparently. So yeah, if we go to the next slide, that's our last message, what we want to leave you with. Reduce, invest, and advocate. Like our future depends on it, because it does. And that was it for the content. If you go to the next slide, just in case you think that your company should be investing in beyond value chain mitigation, but you still lack a bit the theoretical knowledge about it, or you still need some help to create a strategy, then do not hesitate to contact us, because we offer, of course, those webinars like today. So I invite you to join them, the next ones. But we also offer bespoke bespoke workshops. If you go to the next slide, mainly educational and strategy workshops, which can be pretty much tailored to your needs. So if you need help, do not hesitate to reach out to us. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and we are going to take some questions. Let me have a look. So we already have a few questions here. I guess there's one for Stephanie. How do I choose project as a company when I want to start to invest in carbon credits?
Thank you so much. And please keep the questions coming, by the way. Everything that we cannot cover now, we will sure to follow up. How do I choose projects? Well, I think that there is no right or wrong answer. That would be my answer. I think it depends a little bit on what you want to do as a company, what your main goal is. But generally, or very commonly, I see two approaches when talking to clients. So first of all, the first one would be the companies look into their value chains. Where do they have production sites? Where do they have locations on their operations? And invest into those countries, because they feel like this is a country where I have an exposure, so I also want to invest in those countries. That's one approach. The other one is, for example, the SDG approach. So Sustainable Development Goals by the UN are something that is at the core of a lot of companies' sustainability strategy, and usually companies have picked a couple of those that they are focusing the strategy on. And it is also possible to look into projects or invest in projects that also cover these kind of projects or these kind of SDGs with all the co-benefits that come with it. So that's, I think, the most two common approaches, I would say. Cool. Maybe, do you want to take the second one, Leonard? It is around the SBT framework that you shared. Can you explain a little bit more on how the SBT framework works concretely?
Okay, so I guess that refers to the process of the SBT. So the process is quite simple. First, you have to have your board commit to setting targets. So basically they have to sign a letter saying we are committing to setting targets in the coming years, and then send it to the SBTi. Then the company has, I believe, 24 months to set the targets. So they have short-term targets and long-term targets that have to be set, and then you have to explain how you intend to reach these targets. Then once you have that plan and your targets, you have to submit them to the SBTi, which will have a look at them, check if they make sense, if they're achievable, and if your roadmap makes sense. And then if that's the case, then they will accept them. If not, then you'll have to rework them a bit. And then once you have your targets validated, you have to communicate openly about it, and also disclose your progress annually. So when you have, then you'll have your targets and hopefully your roadmap, and you can start working on reducing your emissions and investing in beyond value chain mitigation. While at the same time, it's very important to make sure that you are reporting on a yearly basis on your progress. And I won't go too much into details because there's different pathways for different industries. Depends also on the structure of your carbon emissions, for example, the size of your scope 3, etc. But basically, what pretty much all companies will have to do when they set their targets, they'll have to reduce to switch to renewable energy in the short term, and then reduce their emissions by around 90% over the long term. So it's quite a big undertaking in the end. But yeah, I believe it gives you, I guess most of you here are working in the sustainability team, and I would say the framework gives you a kind of roadmap and kind of legitimation within your company in order to be able to push some reduction measures. So you have a bit that kind of framework that will help you, and a bit, I guess that's a bit the whole idea of the SBTi, to create a kind of framework that all companies more or less agree on, and that's used by most companies, and that creates a kind of global movement for reductions. I hope I answered the question. We have a few other ones. There's one related to cost, so I guess it's related to carbon credits. what kind of cost do I have to expect, Stephanie?
Yeah, we actually have two on the costs, so that's perfect. That's hitting both of those. In regards to cost, it's a little bit hard to pinpoint exact numbers because there are so many different aspects that play a factor here. So it's the technology, obviously, it's the country that plays a huge role, and also the co-benefits that you mentioned earlier. Sometimes that's being overlooked, but having a broader range of co-benefits obviously also increases that, increases the impact. But to give a ballpark number, I would say it starts with renewable energy projects, for example, that are starting with a couple of euros, €4, roughly speaking, but that goes up to a few hundreds for technical removals, for example. Technical removal projects are, as mentioned, a very new technology, so it's very rare. It's not scaled yet, and therefore it is much more expensive currently. But hopefully that will change in the future. Cool. So that got those two out of the way. Maybe, Lionel, there is another one that goes a little bit into the conversations about carbon credits in general that we've seen in the last couple of months. The question is, how can we make sure we are communicating correctly about carbon credits and investing into carbon credits?
Yeah, so that's a good one. I guess what's interesting about it is companies are being criticized for making voluntary contributions on top of their efforts on reducing their emissions. So that's why it's called the voluntary carbon market. So no one's forcing these companies to invest in this project, yet they are still criticized. And I guess it refers to the word greenwashing. So more and more companies do not communicate about the climate action anymore because they're afraid of being criticized and accused of greenwashing. And I guess that's all about the communication. I guess what I would say is there's no one size fits all solution, but key principles that company can take into account, for example, transparency. So communicate in kind of a fair way, not only about positive things, but also on your challenges. Even if you haven't reached your targets, you can explain why. You can say what you're going to do next year in order to improve your strategy and the measures that you're taking. And I guess that will help to create trust. I guess also being precise and not exaggerating is part of the answer. So really use facts, use numbers, and be precise about your impact, and also be thorough about your explanation. So if you invest in beyond value chain mitigation, then explain why you do that. Explain that it's part of kind of holistic climate strategy and not just something that you do on the side that comes a bit out of nowhere. So I guess if you have a strong foundation, if you have set targets, and if you do the investment under the framework of beyond value chain mitigation, and you communicate quite clearly about it, then you should be able to avoid the main issues.
Cool.
So I hope
maybe
I answered the question. Yeah.
There is another one that goes a little bit into the same direction, and I just wanted to follow up with that. If you wanna share your views on that as well. Who manages the actual avoidance projects, and who does the verification to make sure that they're actually achieving the goal?
Yeah, that's a very good one. So I guess it's going to be explained even better I think it's in the third webinar where we talk about quality assurance, the whole process of project development. But the big lines are: first, you have a carbon developer, which develops the project, which has to prepare a lot of documentation explaining what the project is going to do, who owns the land, for example, for forest protection project, and then calculate the baseline, etc. So that's the job of the project developer. Prepare the document, then the document will be reviewed by the standards, and the standards work with different methodologies. So for each project type, there is a methodology that has been validated by each standard, so you have to follow that methodology. And then when you submit that to the standard, and I think there's also a third-party check. So you have the project developer, you have the standard, and you have third party. And this document are checked by the standard and the third party. Then it's validated. Then the project starts, and then at each emission time. So, for example, a project emits or generates carbon credits every 3 or 5 years, depending on the project. And every time they are credited, then they will have the project developer will have to provide documentation about that, and then it's going to be reviewed, and then it's going to be accepted by the standard. And the carbon credits are going to be then entered into a registry, which makes sure that the carbon credits are only retired once. So I hope I didn't get lost in answering the question and answered it, but I guess that's in the essence the answer.
Cool.
And maybe, so we have 2 minutes left. Maybe the last question, there is one about the share of avoidance in removal projects. So why do you currently suggest to have a higher share of avoidance than removal project? Is it because you expect that the removal credit prices will fall in the near future? Do you want to take it, or shall I?
Sure. I'm gonna start, and feel free to chime in. So first of all, it's from a financial aspect, it's much more tangible as shared initially, to start with avoidance projects. It is important to invest in them so that they will scale up and will then become more tangible in the future and easier to purchase in that sense. But right now there is also a lack of availability, right? Because there are not as many projects available to purchase credits for. So that's also why that is our suggestion to handle it that way. I don't know, Lionel, if you wanna add on to that.
No, that's exactly the 2 points that I had in mind. So the price is not really accessible at the moment, or depending on the technology, of course, there are some nature-based removals which are more accessible. But if we're looking, for example, at technical removals, then at the moment, I guess the classical company will not have the means to invest solely in that, and then the availability is also limited. So I guess with that, we will close today's session. I guess you can go to the next slide. Just yeah. So feel free to sign up for the next webinars. We'll see you in around 1 month for carbon removals. That was a great way to finish the webinar. So feel free to join. And thank you very much for your attention. And we wish you a great afternoon.